Welcome to the second lecture in the series, Perspectives on Economic Liberty, hosted by the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty here at Arizona State University. The Perspectives lecture series emerges from the Center's mission, which is to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. One of the ways to pursue that mission is to invite a variety of guests who will interrogate our center's topic, evaluating its role in human betterment for good or ill, revisiting the history of debate over economic liberty, and also considering its relation to other values and freedoms that we may possess. Today's talk obviously falls into the latter category. Our guest today is Anthony Gill, professor of political science at the University of Washington. He also serves as adjunct professor of sociology there, and a distinguished senior fellow at the Baylor University Institute for Studies of Religion. Professor Gill specializes in political economy and religion and politics, with an emphasis on church-state relations, religious liberty, and religious economies. Additionally, he's become internationally renowned for his defense of tipping, which he spoke about yesterday. He is the author of The Political Origins of Religious Liberty and Rendering unto Caesar, the Catholic Church and the State in Latin America. Professor Gill has also published numerous journal articles, book chapters, and was the creator and host of the podcast Research on Religion. He appeared twice also as a guest on Econ Talk with Russ Roberts. I mentioned this because it's my favorite podcast. Once on religion and once on tipping. I guess we're following Russ and getting him to speak on these two topics. Tony's current research agenda includes an examination of how norms function to coordinate behavior in society in lieu of government, and he's working on a number of projects, including the comparative endurance of religious institutions, how clashing norms and values can diminish liberty, and slightly different track, the economics of the campus systems of fraternities and sororities. He is also working on a co-authored book on the societal benefits of religious liberty. He teaches courses in political economy, public choice, and religion and politics. He was the recipient of the University of Washington's Distinguished Teaching Award in 1999. He was actually preceded in that award 21 years previously by the late Paul Hayne, who I am privileged to have counted as a friend and mentor, and who incidentally was the person who really began to urge me to write about religion and economics in the work of Frank Knight, and also Chicago economics. In his spare time, Professor Gill is interested in camping, outdoor cooking, boxing and the martial arts, scuba diving, the Old West, property rights, and golden retrievers. He has backpacked Philmont twice, each time climbing Mount Baldy, completed 2 marathons, holds a black belt in Taekwondo, and frequently dives the Molokini crater in Maui. He also carries a puppet around with him and frequently has pictures of the puppet in places or doing things which are of interest. You might get a chance to see it if you are lucky. Let's welcome Tony Gill to ASU.
Oh, thank you for that introduction. I'm glad you mentioned the puppet, because that'll just, if you think the stuff I'm talking about is crazy, then you're validated with the puppet. I also like the fact that you mentioned that I'm internationally renowned in tipping, and I put that on my webpage at the University of Washington, because one time I gave the tipping talk and there was somebody from France in the audience, and I said, one person, internationally renowned, definition settled. So we have that there. I want to thank you all for coming and thank you for having me out to this. It's really interesting what you're doing here with the Skettle Center, and really exciting to see. So I'm glad that this is going on. I'm glad to be one of the guests here, so hopefully I'll do well. When Ross contacted me about this, he asked me, do you want to do a talk on religious liberty? I said, great, because I do a lot of work on religious liberty and economic growth. And he says, well, our center is about liberty, so could you do something on religious freedom and economic liberty. And I said, sure, that'd be no problem. You asked me to speak about something. This is the first time I've given this talk, and it's going to be a little bit interesting because while I normally am talking about long-term economic growth, I don't tie it directly to economic liberty, which I will be doing today. But as you will see, I do think that economic liberty and long-term economic growth are connected. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of a nuance in the regular talk that I give here. I start off with this picture. If you don't know who this is, you've probably never been to Princeton. That is a picture of Samuel Davies, the first president of Princeton. It was the University of New Jersey at the time when he started it. And he has this really interesting quote because he was a itinerant Presbyterian minister back in the colonial days. And as you will see a little bit later in the discussion here, the presentation here, he had this really interesting quote that I think summarizes what I want to speak here. He wrote to the Board of Trade, or the Lords of Trade, I said, in about the 1750s, when he was doing his itinerant missionary work, and found himself completely vexed by the Congregationalists up in the New England area. And he says, this has got to stop. You got to stop harassing us, arresting us, even though we're not the faith that you are. And he made an appeal to the British Lords of Trade, saying this: a free exercise of religion is so valuable a branch of true liberty, and so essential to enriching and improving of a trading nation, it should ever be held sacred in His Majesty's colonies. And there's some important things here. Religious freedom is a branch of true liberty, and it helps to enrich and improve a trading nation. True, he was saying that it is sacred to His Majesty's colonies. I just have a little addendum here, and to non-monarchists too. So this is a good thing that I think can actually be generalized all the way around here. So I start off my talks. What are the questions that I'm going to be addressing? And then we'll talk about the answers right away. What are the motivating questions for this talk? Well, the first one, is there a relationship between religious liberty and economic freedom? If yes, what is the nature and the causal direction of that relationship? If no, can the audience leave early? As I will argue here, yes, there is a relationship, which means no, you cannot leave early. Please bolt the doors. Thank you. What I'm going to make an argument very similar to what Samuel Davies did was that religious freedom is part and parcel of a broader concept of liberty. It's a branch of that broader liberty. Samuel Davies, I think, expressed it very well. That allows individuals to exchange voluntarily, and that exchange voluntarily is going to be important here in a second. Because if you're an economist, if you're an economics major, I want you to start thinking about economics in terms of exchange rather than buying and selling. Exchange is an important aspect of it with one another. In turn, this leads to greater levels of social flourishing. That is going to be the argument I made. And then there's going to be an iffy contention a little bit later on that while likely coterminous, religious liberty and economic liberty tend to go hand in hand, and the direction is often multi-causal, going both ways. Religious liberty may be a leading indicator of greater economic freedom. It's one of the projects that I'm thinking about, which relates to some other economists who are working on how do we get to more open, economically free societies. And you'll see that coming up here in the future. I want to start with a prologue here, because many of you are probably wondering, wait, this is all about a center on economic thought. We're going to talk about economic liberty. There's that emphasis on that. Why are we having to do anything with religion? Ross, what are you thinking about? Religious is epiphenomenal. Don't you remember Friedrich Nietzsche said, God is dead, right? Case solved. As many of my colleagues reminded me when I first was hired at the UW some 24 years ago, they said that religion thing is really cute, but it's going to go away pretty quick, so why don't you find another project? And the one thing that I always like to remind them, is that if you, political scientists, and maybe economists as well, political economists, are interested in studying institutions throughout history, the survival of states, why states endure, why they fail, etc., etc., I just want to point out a little fact. This institution here, the Roman Catholic Church, has been around for 1,700 years at least, if not 2,000. And this could also be branched out to the Orthodox Christian Church. But the Roman Catholic Church is the longest standing formal hierarchy with leadership exchange that has ever existed in human history. If you were a political scientist or a political economist, wouldn't you want to know why that is? By the way, it has 1 billion adherents to it too, people who owe varying degrees of loyalty, that if the Pope says one thing, many people follow, like citizenship for nations. That seems kind of important too. So to think that religion is unimportant or it's going to go away, I don't know. History tells a different story. And it's not only the Catholic Church. Judaism has been around for 3,300 to 5,000 years, depending how it's measured. You have Hinduism, been around for 5,000 years. And again, not a formal hierarchy, but if you think of Judaism and Hinduism, add to it Islam and Buddhism, have also been around for more than 1,000 years, right? If you add those to the mix as well, these are social movements that have endured for very, very long periods of time and are not going anywhere. You know, Islam also commands 1 billion adherents, been around for 1,400 years. You know, Buddhism has been around for a similarly long time, 2,000 or 3,000 years as well, commands almost 1 billion adherents as well. So a lot of religion out there in the world, and it has a lot of importance. I always laugh at people telling me about the new social movements. These things are coming and we've never seen anything like them in the world. Oh, really? I've been studying this for a long time. On top of it, not only do you have these things, these institutions and social movements that have been around for a very long time, but this guy has been around for 64 years. That's Russ Roberts. And we tried bringing him out to the University of Washington to lead a discussion seminar on a Saturday once, and he refused to do it because he's a practicing Jew, and he doesn't work on Saturdays. And we offered him a lot of money. Right? And he made a choice. He had a little opportunity cost here. Take the money or, basically remain true to his belief system and observe the Sabbath. An economist who says religion matters. So one point I want to get across in all of this, religion matters. And as political economists, if we do think it's epiphenomenal and not very important, I want you to kind of reconsider that. Religion has been around a long time, influences a lot of people's lives. It may have something to do with the way we live our economic, social, and political lives outside of the religious sphere as well. So let's talk about some definitions here. What do we mean when we're talking about economic liberty? I'm going to define economic liberty very simply. Any regulation, any government regulation that increases the cost of an individual or group's ability to voluntarily exchange with another person, voluntarily exchange goods and services, or contracting is another way to say that, represents a decrease in economic liberty and vice versa. Okay, if that you reduce the cost of being able to exchange with others freely, that increases economic liberty. Very simple in terms of that. So I kind of pull this basic stuff from Adam Smith, and this is where I'm going to connect it a little bit to economic growth here, because Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations had a very, very simple recipe for social flourishing. He was interested in the wealth of nations. What causes it? It's right there in roughly the first 2 or 3 chapters of the first book. He says the division of labor plus the widening of markets, of the ability to exchange voluntarily with one another, is going to yield economic prosperity. The division of labor basically is the font of all efficiency and gains of prosperity in society. This also includes technology in there. We figure out better ways to do things, use the resources we have more efficiently to produce more value. The widening markets is where the liberty comes in, because Smith says that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. The wider the market is, the more you can specialize in specific tasks, the more you can get better on it, the more society will be will flourish. But economic liberty is really important here because you need to expand not only across national borders, but within national borders. The more people you can exchange with, the better it will be for society, and that yields economic prosperity here. Now, I want to point out here in terms of prosperity, an important axiom here. I say individuals by and large, but not entirely, will be driven by the pursuit of individual prosperity broadly defined. Okay? I'm a believer in the basic economic assumption that humans are utility maximizers. But that does not mean money solely. Again, take a look at Russ Roberts. He's very interested in being true to his religious faith and worshiping. That's something that's important in his utility function, as we would say in economics. If you think about economics just in terms of money or material wealth, you're limiting yourself. Think about what people want in terms of religious spirituality, their connections with God and worshiping with other individuals. And again, the whole trick in the Smith book, I think it's interesting that there will be rent-seeking behavior. People will always try to gain advantage, which is not conducive to liberty. They will use government to try to move resources to them. So the trick of all this is to get societal prosperity and individual liberty to conform with these individual motivations. And I think in part, this is what is going to be happening with the connection between religious liberty and economic liberty here. So let's talk about religious liberty and bring this into the discussion here. I want you to think of religious liberty for a moment not as a moral issue, but as a matter of government regulatory policy, just as you would with economic liberty. Now, this does not mean that it is not a moral issue. I do believe that religious liberty can be discussed within the confines of a moral philosophy type of argument, but often we just leave it there and we don't make the connection that, yeah, this is also about government policy, whether or not people can freely exchange with one another to satisfy their spiritual needs. And I think that is very important to think about, because it's one of the motivators for how we get religious liberty. So just like economic liberty, I define it as any regulation that increases the cost of an individual or group's ability to believe, worship, and proselytize as they best choose, represents a decrease in religious freedom and vice versa. Okay, if you lower the cost for them to gather together and worship with one another, that is an increase in religious liberty. A few important things here. Most restrictions on religious liberty come at the group level. Deal with group worship. It's very difficult. I guess we haven't gotten to the point of a clockwork orange yet, but it's very difficult to regulate somebody's internal beliefs, although restricting ability of people to worship together can affect how one believes. But most of the restrictions on governments focusing on reducing religious liberty come in the form of group restrictions. The other thing to point out is that religious liberty is not dichotomous and it is not absolute. Early on in a lot of discussions of religious liberty, I thought if you have a constitutional declaration that says we're going to be a religiously free country, voila, you have a religiously free country. Well, that's actually not the case, and I'll show you in a second why that is. And nor is it absolute, because some people's ability or desire to worship as a group can impinge upon other people's rights as well. There's the ubiquitous problem of negative externalities in economics, and so there has to be some kind of restrictions. And I put this here because I always had a colleague who harassed me saying, oh, you believe in this religious liberty stuff. Well, there's no religious liberty in the United States because you're not allowed to have a cannibalistic vampire cult that sacrifices children. And I'm like, oh, really? Okay. You're right, because murder is a negative externality, and we do limit that. But you still can conceive of it on a continuum, and focusing on religious liberty in terms of regulatory policy rather than moral absolutes allows you to kind of gauge whether or not you're moving in a favorable direction toward religious liberty or an unfavorable direction. And as I mentioned, any government policy that affects the cost of worship and proselytization is going to impinge upon religious liberty. I'm holding informal persecution aside, societal actors acting on their own to harass and persecute and murder and all those other things of religious believers, and really kind of focusing on government actions here. And there's a lot of government actions that can impinge upon a group's ability to worship. And I'm going to go through these pretty quick. I've written extensively about these. As I mentioned before, one of the ones that everybody keyed upon several decades ago was a constitutional declaration. Nearly every country in the world has a declaration that they're a religiously free country. But we really kind of know that some countries are less free than others. The way that they're able to restrict the religious liberty of different religious groups is actually endless. I'm surprised at the ways that you can actually restrict freedoms. One is restrictions on missionaries, either from abroad or even internally. There's many communities that prohibit Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses from going door to door. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, but it is a thing to be reckoned with. Registration requirements. In order for a religious group to organize and get certain privileges like tax-exempt status, they have to meet certain requirements in terms of this. These next two are very big ones. Ownership and property restrictions, as well as zoning regulations. What can you build and where can you build it? Religions tend to thrive when they worship together, and to worship together you need a place to worship, and if you restrict the ability of a church or a religious group to build a building to gather together, or you put it 5 miles outside of town, making it difficult for regular adherents to get to, you can really damage a religious group. And I've done extensive research on these issues of property rights of religious organizations, including zoning regulations. Media access, can you own a print or a printing press? Can you own a radio station, television station? Public displays of religion, the clothing, this is a big thing in Europe, whether you can wear a hijab or a crucifix or a kippah. Loudspeakers and parades in Latin America. The Catholic Church has lobbied the government to restrict evangelicals by prohibiting them from having parades and leading people into their churches. Parking, too. I mean, it gets down to that. You want to kill off a church? Deny them parking. Believe it or not, it works, right? I've seen many of this. Not only are these restrictions that could be applied on any or all religious groups, there's another category of religious liberty that allows privileges for one group but not for the other. So this is kind of favoritism to one or maybe a handful of religious groups that disadvantage other groups, and these include a wide variety of things, of preferential tax status given to some groups and not to others. If you don't have to pay taxes to join this church, but the other church has to pay taxes, that's a competitive disadvantage for them. State-collected taxes or tithes. In Germany, they still do this for the Catholic Church and the German Lutheran Church. They collect tithes for that. And it's very difficult for evangelicals to expand there because you're already paying for the Catholic Church. You know, why would I want to go and pay again for another church? That's kind of double dipping. You can get exemptions from this, but they tend to be rather onerous. Preferential subsidization. Some churches get money from the government that others don't. Access to public school, other institutions such as the military and prisons. Life cycle regulations. Do you have to get married in a certain church? Do you have to be buried that way? All those things, not so much here in the United States, but many other countries have that, as well as office holding requirements. So there's a lot of ways that you can restrict religious liberty that are really only limited by policymakers' imaginations here. I just want to put that on the table here. Now I want to talk about the relationship of church and state in history and make the claim that religious liberty on this kind of scale has been comparatively rare. Religious liberty has not been found throughout history. Most of the time, throughout most of history, in most places, you see a government aligning with one or two religious confessions, favoring one and denying various rights, equal rights to minorities here. And there's a reason for this, right? There's a logical reason for this that kind of gets to the heart of political economy. And we start off by looking at political incentives. Right? If you're a policymaker and you're trying to make policy toward religious organizations, well, what is your concerns? As a politician, there are three things in political economy that we accept as being the preference profile, the ranked preference profile of politicians. The first one of these is political survival. You need to stay in office. In a democratic society, that means getting reelected, or getting elected and then getting reelected. In a dictatorial society, that means making sure that there's no internal coup that overthrows you or a revolution that's going to topple your regime. You have to be in office, because if you're not in office, you're not making any policy. So first and foremost, stay in office, political survival. The next thing is tax revenue. One of the things that helps you stay in office is that you collect revenue and you provide public goods for the citizens. They like that, roads and schools and all that kind of stuff. But you can also use the tax revenue to pay off potential enemies. Right? Just hand out money, and that will become important a little bit later here. So you need to get money. And plus, you know, on top of this, you're a ruler, you like to live in palaces. Right? That's what you like. And then finally, the last thing is economic growth. Economic growth is important because if a society is growing and you're extracting the same tax rate, you're going to get more tax revenue, which is going to help your political survival. Plus, if the economy is growing, people are generally happy and they want to keep you in office. But really what drives all of this is political survival. What about religious institutions, specifically the clergy, the leaders of these religious institutions? Do they have motivations? Yeah. They're out there to spread the truth of God, the Word of God as they see it. And since they have the Word of God, one of the things they want to do is make sure that everybody does believe it. So their interest primarily is in maximizing membership, getting as many people to believe their beliefs as possible, bringing people into the pews, etc., etc. And on top of this, they also want revenue. Because as an institution, the more revenue that you have coming in, the more resources you have coming in, you can build buildings, pay clergy, which go out and missionize and bring people into the pews. That's really good. So you want money and resources. Now, for the most part, clergy have a hard time actually gaining tax revenue throughout history. They have not had a lot of coercive power. They use moral suasion to convince people to tithe, but because they're dealing with these things called credence goods, it's often difficult for people to trust in doing that. So it's easy for them to go over to the politicians and say, hey, we're having problems raising revenue and keeping people within our church. In fact, there's these religious minorities, these dissenters out there that are competing with us. Could you get rid of them and subsidize us to make sure that we can fulfill their mission? And the politicians at the other end say, oh, okay, well, what's in it for us? And they say, well, bless your regime. There's always uncertainty that citizens have about the political regime, and they want to go to somebody they can trust saying, oh, should we obey the rules that are set before us? Should we pay the taxes that the king wants us to pay? And if the bishop who you trust with your soul and salvation says, yes, trust that politician, you do it. And if you just do it willingly, that's great for the politician because they don't have to expend a lot of money trying to monitor and enforce your behavior all the time. That saves them some resources in policing. And so there tends to be this natural affinity for church-state cooperation throughout history, right? And I just have this little kind of aside here. This is that guy from Jurassic Park. He says, life always finds a way. One of my underlying optimistic assumptions about humanity is that freedom always finds a way. So there's always dissenters and religious minorities trying to break through the cracks and trying to provide freedom for themselves and also for other individuals as well. But for the most part, you have churches trade legitimacy for politicians in exchange for restrictions on competitors as well as financing for the church. If the king collects taxes for you and gives it to you, much easier to basically expand your religious congregation. Easy to do that. So, if church and state have historically been aligned, two questions immediately arise here. Why do we ever get religious liberty in the first place? And I pose this question as an issue of government regulation in a political economy term. Why would a state ever deregulate a religious market? Historically, these church-state affinity for cooperation means that there's a monopolistic market. There's usually just one church or one confession within any given society enforced by the state. How could you ever get this religious liberty that would allow a multiplicity or a myriad, a pluralism of religions to actually arise? And again, this is just like any other type of question in political economy, right? Why would the government actually deregulate any industry? If they're interested in control and power, why would they deregulate airline industries? Why would they deregulate telephone industries, et cetera, et cetera? So I'm kind of situating this discussion within the political economy framework. And then, given that I'm changing the rhetoric a little bit to think about government deregulation in a political economy framework, is any of this related to advancing economic freedom and growth? And that's where we're going to turn next. So I got a couple arguments that I'd like to make. And a few years, probably 6-7 years ago, I was approached by Georgetown University and asked to write a paper about religious liberty and economic growth. And I wrote this paper, Religious Liberty and Economic Development, Exploring the Causal Connections. I had 6 different pathways that religious liberty actually enhanced societal growth, 3 of which relate to economic liberty. And we're going to discuss these in terms of that. The first one is the religious economy pathways, where I'm going to argue that religious liberty actually is economic liberty. The second pathway is through migration and merchants, or I should say migration and commerce. I just used M&M because that's more alliterative. But the migration and commerce thing basically says that economic liberty is going to yield religious liberty. So the pathway, the causal direction I talked about at the beginning of the talk is economic liberty leads to religious liberty. Then the last one, I argue, is something I call the contingent liberties pathway. That religions that fight for their own freedoms actually end up in a spillover fashion enhancing the freedoms in other areas of society for economic and political actors. And so in this regard, religious liberty leads to economic liberty, and religious liberty might actually be a harbinger for a freer society economically and politically. That's the last thing we'll explore there. So let's go into this first one here, religious economy pathway, wherein religious liberty is equal to economic liberty. And I want to make this case. And for economists, economic students out there, this is a really important thing to wrap your head around when it comes to studying economics, because so many of my undergraduates come in and they think the economics is talking about money and banking and those kind of things. They have a very narrow view of what economics is. And I tell them, economics is really the study of how we allocate resources amongst one another in society. It's about exchange. It's about free exchange or non-free exchange and what kind of results each of those pursue. And I just want to explain to folks that religious activity is economic or exchange activity. Something happens there. Just as if you went to the store and bought a six-pack of Gatorade, and they exchange that for you. You say, I'll give you, $5 and you give me the Gatorade, and that's all fine. The same thing happens oftentimes on Sundays or Saturdays or Fridays. Whenever you go into your congregation, you say, I would like to hear about the Word of God. I want to hear these answers of life. Why are we here? Where are we going? And somebody goes and who specializes this stands up and tells you, okay, we're going to read from this chapter, and this is what this, oh, that's great. And you exchange. You either drop some money into the plate that's passed around, or you volunteer your time to clean up the grounds or watch over the kids in the congregation or do different things like that. There is an exchange. Religious activity is economic activity, right? And I want to point out, because we had a person on our team who was, basically wanting to make the case religious activity is economic activity. He went around trying to measure all the money stuff. How many Bibles are sold, how much money falls into the plate of congregations, building church buildings, valuing those things, and kind of add that all up. And that's kind of nice. Economists like measures and things like that. But really, it's just about, here's somebody that wants to do something with somebody else. They should have the freedom to do that. That's an exchange, just like me going into a store and wanting to buy this, that, or the other thing, and the store owner saying, yeah, I'd be happy to exchange that with you. Here's the terms. Do you agree to the terms? Yes, great, we exchange. And then I would say that any increase in the ability of people to gather together and worship actually represents greater economic freedom. Right? You allow people to do something they want to do, to engage with somebody else. It says, I will give you some volunteer time if you tell me about the Word of God. We'll trade, we'll exchange. That is economic activity. So religious liberty at one fundamental level is equal to economic liberty. That's where the relationship tends to be there. It's a branch from the same tree of true liberty, just as Samuel Davies noticed some 250 or some odd years ago. So that's the easy one. Here's the other one, and I've spent a lot of time looking at this one. It's the migration and merchant pathway, where an economic liberty actually promotes religious liberty. And I wrote extensively about this in a recent book, well, it's actually 10 years old now, The Political Origins of Religious Liberty, and that I've also done talking about some issues on property rights and things like this. So I want to go into detailing this. How did religious liberty come about? Many people say it was just a good idea, and John Locke and later on James Madison says, hey, I got this idea, religious liberty is good, and everybody says, oh yeah, we never thought about that before. And voila, you had it. But My argument in this book was that it wasn't that easy. Good ideas aren't always implemented into policy. They oftentimes need to be incentivized for the policymaker in order to be legislated for the society as a whole. And so the argument I make in the political origins of religious liberty is, how did we get religious liberty in places like the United States, Latin America? I talk about the Baltic states and Russia as well in this book. I says, well, it's been a desire for expanded trade and attracting a labor force, migration, immigration, leads to greater tolerance and eventually to religious liberty. So economic desires, basically trying to get wealthy and allowing for free exchange of individuals on various dimensions, is going to lead to greater religious liberty. And I make the argument that when deregulating religion enhances or at least does not threaten the political survival, and that's the number one thing politicians are focused on, when deregulating religion enhances or doesn't threaten political survival, tax and or economic growth, political leaders will favor greater religious freedom amidst growing pluralism in society. Right? So their motive is like, oh, should I, smite these dissenters there? Well, no, that might affect your political survival. Or more importantly, I'm not worried about political survival. Should I smite these dissenters, dominant church? And they say, well, and people in society say, no, wait a minute, we need these people here. So let's go ahead and explore how that actually occurs. And I just want to note again, the book that I wrote here is not making the moral case for religious liberty, but placing it in terms of incentives. You get religious liberty not because it's just a good idea unto itself, which I do think it is, but you have to motivate people. What is going to get a politician to change their mind, put pen to paper and say, okay, we now allow religious dissenters to have their property rights just like the major religion as well, right? So that, well, you have to focus on incentives here. It makes me a political economist. I'll give you a few examples of this. The Netherlands is really the first place where we see religious toleration, which is a preliminary of religious liberty, that people, it might not be legislated that different religions have the same rights, but at least you tolerate them and you don't enforce restrictions upon them. And the Netherlands, where modern commerce and in modern Europe starts, Western Europe is kind of the heart of where capitalism and the boom, eventual wealthy boom kind of starts out. The Netherlands were very important in realizing the importance of religious toleration here. First modern instance of religious toleration, a great book on this by Evan Haefele, talks about how this actually affected the United States, but he has a wonderful first chapter on the Netherlands in and of itself. But if you're interested in European history or modern economic history, the Netherlands is kind of a good place to start, because the Netherlands didn't have a whole lot of stuff. Not a lot of mineral wealth, kind of just this country on the outskirts of Europe. The only thing they did have was the ability to ship goods back and forth between other people. And they realized that that was their comparative advantage early on, the two rivers that they have there, etc. And so one of the things that they realized is that if we want to trade with other individuals, we have to accept people that we don't like. Pluralistic, trade-dependent nation, that's the Netherlands, recognizes the benefit of non-persecution because people will not trade with you if you jail them or kill them, right? And they were, very early on, they accepted Jews in there. They had Catholics that were part of the Habsburg Empire, Spain, influenced by Spain. They had Calvinists come in, but they also had Lutherans. And then the Calvinists actually started splitting amongst themselves. And so they saw all this religious diversity, and they realized if they were fighting amongst one another all the time, nobody would come there to trade. And they said, you know what we're going to do? The Calvinists didn't like the Catholics. The Catholics didn't really like the Protestants. They're still a little bitter over that Reformation thing. But they said, you know what? We all need to get along in order to trade. And so they came up with this interesting policy called connivance. And it has a little bit a different terminology than in the United States, but in Dutch it largely means that we're going to don't ask, don't tell. Okay? Don't get in anybody's face about your religion, and as long as you don't do that, we'll let you practice your religion. And this attracted a lot of people. French Protestants fleeing from French persecution came up there. As you know, the Pilgrims fleeing persecution in Britain from the Church of England, they were dissenters, came to the Netherlands. Said, whoa, we've got to get out of here. And the Netherlands says, hey, yeah, come here. You're very productive people. You're very wealthy individuals. You have a lot of skills in that. Come here and produce with us. And they actually did quite well for themselves. So the Netherlands is where this starts out. England learns this lesson as well, because about the mid-17th century, England went through this bloody civil war that had some economic causes, but also had a religious dimension to it. A number of dissenters who didn't like the direction of the Church of England started fighting against them, and it was very bloody. Oliver Cromwell eventually takes over in his protectorate, and he wasn't all that free either. But they realized that if you're constantly engaged in a civil war and always worried about whether or not the king is going to be of this denomination or that denomination, you're going to have a problem in economic growth. People don't like to invest in places that are filled with civil unrest. And so the Act of Toleration, 1689, just a few short months after the 1688 Glorious Revolution, basically allowed Parliament more control, limited the king and stuff. There's a declaration of religious freedom here. And it was a pragmatic reaction to the English Civil War and increasing pluralism. There were more and more dissenters. Once the Protestant Reformation came about, it was hard to contain all these different schismatic movements, so let's just start to tolerate them all here. They weren't really good with Catholics quite yet, but at least amongst Protestants, they were tolerating them. And it also reduced the tension about what denomination or specific religious flavor any given king is going to have here. It had a huge impact on John Locke, who early in his career was a little bit ambiguous about religious freedom, but he came out later to write his letter on toleration, a rather extensive letter, that says, you know what, religious liberty is good because it calms everybody down, and that's what's important for a flourishing society here. What's also important to observe here as well is that England was looking at the Netherlands. They go, wow, they're getting really wealthy as a trading nation. I wonder how they're doing it. Oh, I guess because they're pretty tolerant of people. So why don't we do that? And following the disruption about James II and whether he was going to be Catholic or not as the Restoration king, they decided to get rid of James II and get a new king, and they picked an Orange, William of Orange. And it became William and Mary, and there's a college named after him and all that kind of stuff. So, little thing there. This act also was very helpful because it was at least something on paper. If you know anything about England, they don't have a formal constitution. They just kind of glue laws together over time. But this was one of the important laws that many American dissenters actually relied upon to justify themselves. And as I mentioned, it influenced John Locke and as well as Adam Smith. You can read in Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations. He has a fairly extensive passage about what religious freedom is really all about. And it's a fascinating read if you haven't read it. Filled with great language, too. The United States is really the first country that codifies religious liberty. The Netherlands had connivance. It was don't ask, don't tell. The laws on the book don't really give religious liberty, but we're not going to enforce it. Same thing with the Act of Toleration. It's more toleration than actual liberties. But in the United States, we actually ended up with the First Amendment that says, nope, we're going to level the playing field for all, allow free exercise for all the religions, and not allow a single establishment amongst the 13 original states and all subsequent states that come about. So how does this come, right? It's interesting because you might have, in the third grade around Thanksgiving time, celebrated the Pilgrims and religious liberty and things like that. Well, hate to break this to you, but the United States, or at least the colonial British colonies, were not a bastion of religious liberty. While the Pilgrims, or the Puritans that followed them, they're brethren of them, followed them to Massachusetts, fleeing religious persecution in England, they were quick to visit it upon other people, especially Quakers. Oh, did they hate Quakers. This is a picture of Mary Dyer here, who kept coming into the colony, and they say, Mary Dyer, don't you do your Quaking stuff. We don't like Quakers. This is Congregationalist territory. We have a theology, and you have to follow that. But she kept coming back. She was a follower of Anne Hutchinson, who was doing the same thing. And she eventually became a witness for religious liberty, which sounds really good. And there's a statue for her in the Boston Commons that says, Mary Dyer, Quaker. a witness for religious freedom. How did she witness it? She was hanged on the Boston Commons in 1660. Kind of a sucky way to witness religious liberty, right? It really wasn't. They were very intolerant of her religious beliefs. And even the Congregationalists of Massachusetts were very quick to prohibit Quakers from coming from Pennsylvania and moving to Rhode Island and places like that. Eventually, they started to see that this was dissuading people from going through their territory. And so, even though we don't have a history of religious liberty, the conditions in the United States were actually ripe for it. And those conditions were based upon the need to get immigration and to motivate commerce. So let's cover that. Immigration. You have this great wilderness out there. Yes, there's indigenous population, but you need to get settlers out there. And it's very difficult to tell people, hey, why don't you move across the pond? It's a pretty wilderness territory. There's a lot of risks out there. You might go bankrupt. It's difficult. Who wants to go? Ooh, not too many people want to go. So whatever you can do to lower the cost of immigrating or migrating to this new these new colonies is going to be important. One of these things is basic toleration. And this is illustrated, interestingly enough, by a Dutch colony that actually came to the Americas, and they settled this place called New York, although at the time they called it New Amsterdam. And they settled there, and one of the governors there had the same problem. They had all these Quakers coming in, right? They were the Dutch Calvinists. They can't stand Quakers. And so, they said, we want to get rid of these people because they're just annoying. And they wrote back, and the West India Company wrote back to the governor. He says, whoa, wait a minute, okay? Your last letter informed us that you, Governor Stuyvesant, had banished from the province and sent hither by ship a certain Quaker, John Bound, by name, although we heartily desire that these and other sectarians remained away. Ugh, okay? From there. Yet as they do not, they keep coming to Quake. Oh, right? Yet as they do not, we doubt very much whether we can proceed against them rigorously without diminishing the population and stopping immigration, which must be favored at so tender of a stage of the country's existence. You can't persecute Quakers because you need warm bodies there. You want to have a colony? You need a lot of people. You need that division of labor and expanded market to trade amongst. You don't have those people, you're going to fail. So anything you can do to encourage these people, do it. If you discourage them in any given way, don't do that. You want to persecute Quakers? Yes, they quake. Actually, the name Quakers, they actually come to think of them peaceful now. They used to quake a lot, like early Pentecostals. So they did that, but yeah, have them come here. And this was a lesson that was learned by a lot of other places in the colonies as well. You want to bring people to your colony. You want people to settle so it can become an economically prosperous outpost for your countries, right? Consider Roger Williams. Roger Williams was a Puritan who was more puritanical than the Puritans themselves, and they got annoyed with him, and they kicked him out. And he said, fine, I'll go to this place, we'll call it an island of Rhode, or Rhode Island or something like that, right? And he realized that even though he had very strict Calvinist standards for his own faith, he needed people to settle that colony. And so he immediately says, you know what, I'm going to welcome all kinds. And even though you don't share my faith to the vigor that I do, I'm going to bring you in, I'm going to try to convince you, but I need people here because if I don't have those people in my colony, I'm going to fail. And oh, by the way, the United States was not settled exclusively by religious people, as you're often told in the stories about the Pilgrims. They tend to be actually a small minority. Most people who actually settled the colonies were usually young males, late teens, early 20s. If you go to any church today and you look around for the young 20-something-year-old males, you don't find them. They tend to be not really religious-type people. And so a lot of those people were coming in. And so Williams had to say, you know what, these people aren't believers, or at least they're not acting that way. I got to tolerate them because I need them here. I need people here. Same thing with Maryland, right? Britain had this problem with Catholics. They didn't really like them too much, but nonetheless, they were valuable to ship over to the colonies. And there's one guy, Cecil Calvert, said, hey, I'm interested in setting up a colony for you, King. Would you be willing me to have that? And he says, I hereby anoint you Lord Baltimore. Why don't you go over to this place called Maryland? Eventually you'll win a Super Bowl after you take the Browns away from them. He said, I don't understand what that means. But he got it. They granted Catholics. They said this was great for the king too, because the king got rid of a lot of dissenters, or people that were having problems with the Church of England, sent them there, settled the colonies, just by tolerating other individuals, right? And that's very helpful. If you want people to come and prosper in your society, don't chase them away. Okay? The other thing is that even though the Puritans of New England and even the Anglicans then of Virginia wanted to keep a strict hold over what the official religion was in these areas, they noted that people, if they didn't like it, could pick up and easily leave to other places. So they couldn't keep them in the colonies because there's so much land. There's a very low labor to land ratio, or a high, low labor to land ratio, land ratio. And so people just basically picked up and left here. And this is one of the things that the Jesuit historian Thomas Curry noted when he talked about religious freedom. He says, under the harsh conditions of a frontier settlement and in the absence of bishops and ecclesiastical courts, such undeviating procedures of religious establishment, like the Congregationalists tried to establish in New England, were little needed and impossible to maintain in the colony. Right? As a result, unhampered by any strong centralized episcopacy, those holding various Protestant attitudes were able to adjust local worship to suit their preferences. They just picked up and left. This is Albert Hirschman's exit, voice, and loyalty. If you don't like what's going on, you can protest, but if you can pick up and move somewhere else, move somewhere else. But if you need those people in your colony to help the colony become economically prosperous, don't chase them away. Keep them there. And so the Congregationalists, over time, over the decades, had to actually, relax upon their strict religious requirements for being in there. The other thing that comes about from this is that many religious dissenters who were worried about the Congregationalists, not only pounding on the Quakers from Pennsylvania, but they were also, later on, the Methodists, and there were Anabaptists in the 1700s that kept popping up, and the Congregationalists would get upset and not allow them to build buildings, or they would tax them differentially and do all these things. That caused problems. And so there was a number of people that wanted to fight for the rights of religious minorities, and they made explicit references to the king's coffers and economic growth. One of these was Samuel Davies. We started off with him earlier. He says, a toleration and free exercise of religion is such a valuable branch of true liberty and so essential to the improving and enriching of a trading nation, it should ever be held in His Majesty's colonies. Sacred in His Majesty's colonies, it should be there. And again, it's interesting that he wrote this letter to the British Board of Trade. You want to be rich? Let people travel through. Let people exchange with one another. By the way, I'm a Presbyterian. I'm coming through. I'm going to set up a tent. We're going to worship. Don't prevent me from doing that. He did well for himself because eventually he became the president of Princeton. There you have it. For any of you Princetonians out there. Then this guy, the oatmeal guy, William Penn, Quaker, right? He was one too. He was always fighting for the rights of Quakers, because Quakers were really these kind of oddball dissenters, and even the Calvinists just couldn't figure out what to do with these people. And he would write, he kind of noticed this early on. He says, listen, consider peace, plenty, and safety the three great inducements to any country to honor the prince. So he's writing to the king. I want you to, be peaceful and prosperous. I love you, king. And love for the government, as well as the best allurements to foreigners to trade, right? Bring in people, bring in immigrants, bring in merchants that are going to trade with its transports, with it, and transport themselves to it. All of that stuff, this peace, plenty, and safety, is utterly lost by such partialities. And he was talking about restrictions on religious liberty. You're not letting us build buildings. You're throwing us in prison. This is annoying. Men of virtue, good contrivance, great industry, are great contributors to the king's revenue. Ooh. By their traffic. You allow these dissenters to come in, they produce wealth. Guess what you get, king, when wealth is produced? Tax revenue. Remember that? That's number 2 on your thing. Right? That's number 2 on your list. You like this. This very severity, these restrictions on religious freedom, will make more bankrupts in the kingdom of England in 7 years than have been visited upon it in 7 ages. Right? So he understood. Let people freely exchange with one another, irrespective of what their theological differences are, and society will prosper. You want prosperity? Give me religious liberty. Economic liberty and prosperity leads to religious liberty here. That's the pathway. Later on, he had to keep making these things because the Congregationalists just kept persisting. He says, listen, but as the persecution has many arguments for it, so he kind of says, listen, I know there's wacky denominations out there, right? There are some false beliefs, and we need to tamp those down. Yes, there are arguments for religious persecution that are drawn from the advantages that have and would come to the public by it. We don't want them believing those weird stuff. There's trade-offs. So there are diverse mischiefs that must unavoidably follow the persecution of dissenters that may reasonably dissuade from such severity. For they must either be ruined, destroy them financially, fly, get rid of them out of the colony, don't do that, or conform. And now this is really interesting for those of you who are interested in freedom of expression on campus. He says, for they must either be ruined, fly, or conform. And perhaps the last is not the safest. Getting people to conform to your religion, to your beliefs via force is not a good way of winning them over, and it's going to cause problems in the long run. Penn knew this, right? If they are ruined in their estates and their persons imprisoned, modestly compute a fourth of the trade and manufactory of the kingdom sinks. And then those who have helped to maintain the poor through their industry, right, now must come upon the poor's book for maintenance. You bankrupt people, you're going to have to take care of these folks. And that's not good. Understood that. All right. This applies elsewhere. I've been very interested in Latin America, and I started my career kind of being a Latin Americanist scholar. And it's really interesting to note that religious liberty following independence after they broke from Spain and now the chains of mercantilism started to drop from the hemisphere. It was the first nations that were most trade dependent that actually promoted religious liberty. I have this map up here because here's Europe. That's where all the wealth was. You want to trade with them. They could easily trade with the Americas. That's not too far away. But if you were Chile, and that was the first country to implement religious liberty in the late 1800s, if you were Chile, you had to actually convince people from England to come around and go here. Oh, no canal. We're going to have to go around here. Ooh, there's sea monsters. That's very dangerous. And come all the way up here to Santiago, or to Valparaiso, exactly, specifically, to trade with them. And early on, these British traders would come, and the Catholic Church would get really upset when they're worshiping differently, and they'd start having the local constables arrest them. And then the government steps and says, whoa, don't arrest them because they won't come back. Right? There's enough things that they don't want to come here to begin with. It's a long trip, sea monsters, that whole thing. But if you add one more thing to it, we're really going to destroy ourselves. So let's give them religious freedom. Those British traders come, they want to do their Anglican thing, fine, you do it. Religious freedom for you. Right? It's limited. They didn't want them to convert any Catholics, but it's a good start. Same thing with the ABC countries, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, all very trade dependent. They were all the ones that really implemented religious liberty much earlier than other places. And in many other places, such as Colombia and Venezuela, the United States actually tied religious freedoms to trade agreements. Say, if you want to have trade with us, you got to allow some Protestant missionaries in. You weigh it, Venezuela. You weigh it, Colombia. They said, okay, I guess we're going to have to do that because we want to be enriched. China today is a really interesting thing to watch. I'm not expert on China. I have a friend, Carey School at Notre Dame, who really knows this stuff. But it's kind of interesting to see what's happening in China. China does not like religion very much, especially religion that they can't control. They're scared of it, but they also want economic growth. They've had these special economic zones since the late 1970s, early 1980s. And one of the things is you have a lot of people just like Russ Roberts there that want to believe things in worship. They happen to be very entrepreneurial, and they're likely to flee with their cash and their money and their skills unless they're granted religious freedom. And so a lot of these quote-unquote house churches that come about, some of them are illegal and the government gets really worried about them, but the government often allows them to exist right next to, oftentimes in warehouses, right next to very profitable industries because they don't want to chase away these valuable entrepreneurs who are bringing great wealth and tax revenue to China. So there's this connection between those things as well. Third thing, contingent liberty pathway is the last thing I'm going to be talking about here. And this one is I'm standing a little bit more on shaky ground. And the argument I want to make here is that religious liberty is going to lead to economic liberty. I'm inspired here primarily by this article by Mansur Olson back in 1995, I think it was, who made the argument that democracy comes about when you give entrepreneurs certain rights, right? That these things cannot be separated out with one another. It's a really fascinating article. You should read that if you're interested in political economy. And the observation here is that one liberty is not isolated from others. Religious liberty should not be isolated from economic or political liberty. They all come in a similar package here. In fact, you can see this in the Bill of Rights, First Amendment. Right? You read through this, no law, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the free press or the rights of people to peaceably assemble. All these things were not separated by periods. They were separated by semicolons because the founders knew that all this stuff is related. You can't have one without the other. The only thing I'd critique them on is they should have had something about property rights in here, but kind of contained in other parts. But they kind of got this, right? That gathering people together, if you're a religious person, to bring them in, is going to require property rights, rights of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and an equal application of these things under the law for you as a religious individual. Oh, by the way, these are the same things that businesses like as well. To be able to freely speak and advertise, as they say, to make their things, to assemble people, to contract, to have their property rights, and have all of this stuff respected under equal application of the law here. And so I make the argument here that the same bundle of liberties that opens the door for religious minorities, including atheists, by the way. I know people are like, well, religious liberty is just for those. No. Religious liberty in its true form allows people to be non-believers as well. So all you atheists out there, embrace religious liberty because it benefits you too. I'm not somebody who argues for theocracy. Right? I want freedom for atheists as well as evangelicals and the like. They're the same ones needed for most other forms of socioeconomic exchange here. Interesting observation on this, where we first start to see our political rights respected in Western history was the Magna Carta back in 1109-ish. Was it? The first version of the Magna Carta. We just celebrated 500 or 1,000 years of it, right? 800. Okay, well, it was a long time ago. Yeah. Slightly before I was born. It's interesting to note here that we focus a lot on the political rights, but the whole Magna Carta was actually negotiated by the church. Because one of the things that King John did that irritated the church to no end was that whenever he ran out of money, he would nationalize all church property, which was the Vatican's at the time, the Catholic Church, and then sell it back to them. Brilliant strategy, by the way. Right? If you're ever a dictator, keep that in mind. But it was bad because it annoyed the church. Right? And the church then started allied with all these barons and princes and other folks that were upset that their rights were being violated in the same way. And so they negotiated. And this is a drawing of the signing of the Magna Carta. And you can see here an Anglican bishop there in the back saying, hey, don't take our stuff and junk. And King John was rather irritated by that. But what's more interesting is that when you start reading the Magna Carta, the first clause, after all the introductory flowery stuff, is this. We have first of all granted to God that the English church is to be free and to have the full rights and liberties intact in perpetuity. And we have also granted to all the free men in our kingdom all the following liberties, which then apply to everybody else. Religious liberty came first. At least religious liberty for the Anglican church, or I should say, for the Catholic church at that time. So it was actually a Catholic bishop, my mistake, because they weren't Protestant back then. Not the best of history. But you get the point, right? So you have the church kind of leading the way as the spearhead to other religious liberties here as well. And this is where I'm going on this other paper as well. One of the other papers I've actually been greatly influenced by, and if you have a chance to ever read this, it's by Gary Cox, Douglas North, who passed away a few years ago, and Barry Weingast, a paper called The Violence Trap. Excellent paper. I just have been really inspired by this paper, and they make this kind of interesting argument. Unlike what Max Weber said, that states control a monopoly over violence, they say in reality, they don't. States may come about, but there are a lot of other actors in society that have other powers, other violent powers as well. And I kind of think about this. You have the dominant ruler theoretically has 51% of the violence power in society. But then there's other factions. This blue faction has 30%, the green faction 10%, gray faction 7%, the yellow faction has 2%. And so if political survival is first and foremost on your utility function as a leader, you have to think about pleasing these people, because all these people could start to align against you and overthrow you. Now, you still have 51%, so odds are you're going to win. But you know what? The Cleveland Browns just tied the Pittsburgh Steelers this weekend. You can't always be sure of that. Maybe one of these factions starts growing in their power. They become economically wealthy and are able to build bigger spears or influence more people to get on their team. And there's fuzziness about who actually controls resources in society. And so the dominant power has to take revenue and distribute this. We call this rents. Okay? Distribute them to other factions according to their various powers. So for every $100 in tax revenue that the dominant ruler gets, they keep 51%, give 30% to the blue folks, 10% to the green, 7%, etc., to other folks. Right? And that's how you do it. And by the way, the argument of their paper is that creates a bias against economic growth. Because economic growth, that third thing on the list that influences political actors, could be upset if any one of these groups becomes more powerful. Historically, look at how kings hated merchants, because merchants always started growing in power and threatened their hold on power. Right? Peasants were fine because they were always stuck to the land. They ain't going anywhere. They ain't going to get any more power. Peasants were noble. Merchants were dirty, filthy animals who always would challenge them and never paid their tax. Didn't like that. And so for Cox, Weingast, and North, they're kind of very interested in how you actually break out of this and what they call how do you get to open access orders, because history is really this balance of power where political survival and tax revenue always trump the economic growth. But at some point in history, aligning the individual incentives for prosperity with the political incentives for liberty allows for this open access order, and around 1500 in northwestern Europe or so, things really started to change and expand, and we have the wealth that we are benefiting from today. So I was looking at this, I said, this is kind of interesting, because what if it's the case that if there was one faction that was relatively innocuous in society, but would allow for greater economic progress or at least make your civilians happy, and if the leader was fairly secure in their tenure, would they start to grant them liberties? Right? And so here I changed the percentage a little bit. You have a ruler, 70% of the violence potential, so they're pretty secure. They're feeling good in their political survival. But what if one of these groups just wanted a little bit more freedom? And they were pretty prosperous individuals, or you could attract prosperous individuals. Religions don't have armies usually. They're pretty innocuous. So grant them some freedoms. Yeah, you can have some freedoms to worship. Well, then those freedoms spill over to others. Open access for one group might have benefits potentially for opening the door of liberty to other groups in society. And where are we looking for these things? I got some friends and colleagues that were working on this. Could religious liberty be a harbinger for greater economic and political liberty? We're kind of looking at this. We tend to see them occur at the same time, but is it that initial opening of religious liberty that allows the door for economic liberty to open a little bit wider here? And again, you kind of see this with the Netherlands, the British Glorious Revolution, and colonial United States. is that, yeah, we're motivated by economic growth and stuff, so, you know, lay off the religious folks, and then once you start doing that, you say, okay, let's just start allowing other liberties to apply to other groups in society. It tends to expand. It's hard to kind of link because they tend, again, to be very coterminous. Same thing, Latin America in the earliest 20th century. Religious liberty tended to precede a lot of economic liberties. Right? And so that's kind of very interesting to observe as well. Again, China and Africa are something that we're really interested in looking at as well here. Africa is going through an enormous explosion of religious activity, not only in terms of Islam, but in terms of Christianity, Pentecostalism, various forms of evangelical. And there's surprisingly, a lot of religious liberty in Africa. And you're starting to see some of these countries now, a few exceptions, you know, Zimbabwe and maybe South Africa and stuff right now, starting to realize that these freedoms are actually important for the rest of society. So I'm kind of bullish on Africa as becoming prosperous, at least in the medium term, realizing that if you allow religious freedom, you know, freedom in general, that true branch of liberty will actually be allowed to grow there as well. Russia, interestingly, is a case we're pursuing in the reverse direction. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, everything was good. It was laissez-faire central, and everybody was, this is a great experiment in terms of that. But what you saw by 1998 was that Putin kind of aligned with the Russian Orthodox Church, and Putin had some aspirations of power and building a nationalist type of coalition to secure his power, actually froze the religious economy and froze out a lot of religious minorities. And not surprisingly, shortly thereafter, you started to see Russia become more and more autarkic in its economic liberties, becoming a little bit more corporatist or fascist, however you might want to call it. So there's something to do. It's hard to say, as the relationship seems to be coterminous. Both tend to come with one another. But there is a research project here, and for any of you who are graduate students or even faculty members interested in this as a potential paper, there it is. I love to give ideas for papers as much as I love to give answers to questions. Is there any quantitative evidence for all of this, right? For you economists that love models and numbers and things like that, this is your time to shine. The answer is, I'm not a really good quantitative person anymore. I used to be. But everything kind of flowed past me very quick once they started doing all that R, and you got to reprogram all your computer. I forget that. Fortunately, somebody up at Nazarene University up in Idaho actually did a paper recently on this, Peter Crabb. I was just up there in Boise a week ago. He did a preliminary quantitative test of that paper that I had, and he used longitudinal data for 7 years across several dozen countries, maybe 50 or 60 countries involved in this study here. And here's his findings. Findings were a little bit kind of a bummer for me. He said there's limited statistical support for the relationship, right? But again, he's only dealing with 7 years, and the arguments that I tend to make in my book and in subsequent papers was that religious liberty and economic liberty is a very, very slow process. They tend to occur over time in increments. And he does kind of pick up some of this. He says, while there is no indication that a reduction in religious freedom reduces or slows the rate of change in economic freedom is on the rise in the countries that are also increasing religious freedoms. So what he is finding is this coterminous relationship, but with the data he has, it's very difficult to sort out the directionality of what is going on, and I'm not surprising. Then he says, he finishes up, that trends are suggestive and give cause for further research, which you always need to limit. You always need to finish your papers with. We need further research and more grant money. The interesting thing here, though, is that for a lot of the stuff that I outlined in here, we don't really have very good measures for anyways. And that's going to take some time to develop in terms of quantitative development here. But the problem is that we are searching for our lost keys underneath the lamplight. When really a lot of other stuff, and this is why I argue for a more qualitative approach to find the historical nuances and the connections that actually occur, might be out here in the dark murkiness a little bit more. And the more we investigate out here, we might be able to extend some of that quantitative light to be able to find some better measures and test it. So I have a feeling that over time we will, and a number of people are actually doing that. With that said, I just want to leave you with a few conclusions and open up the questions. The first one of these is religion matters, right? You're an economist, and like, that stuff doesn't really matter. Religion matters, and we shouldn't ignore its role in socioeconomic behavior, even if we might not have the best measures of that. It really does. It's a hugely important part of lives of economists and many other individuals, and to say that this doesn't have any impact in other aspects of our lives is just really silly and selling our analyses short. The next thing is that freedom is freedom. Freedom is freedom, irrespective of whatever realm it may be found in. Religious liberty is economic liberty. Religious liberty enhances economic liberty. Economic liberty enhances religious liberty as well. Folks I was dealing with in D.C. for a while really just wanted to focus on religious liberty. I said, well, no, we got to talk about these other forms of freedom as well. Said, no, that's not our mission. It's just religious liberty. I go, well, you want to get religious liberty? You start making allies with other people who need other freedoms in other areas, because once those people get that incentive to prosper, they're actually going to support your cause as well. So we need to understand that promoting and defending liberty in one arena may well enhance it in another, and that the best promotion is actually from the grassroots with sensitivity to incentives. Right? To tell people that religious liberty or economic liberty is not only valued in and of itself, which it is, but that, listen, you're going to do better for yourself. You are going to prosper socially, economically, politically, if you allow the freedoms that you want to be granted to other individuals in other areas, in places maybe that you might not actually agree with. Freedom is freedom, and that's what I want to conclude with. And with that said, I open up to questions and comments. Okay. I think I ran a little bit long first time I present. Thank you for sticking around, though. Appreciate it.
Yeah, let me come around you.
Thanks so much for an excellent talk. I was wondering if your analysis on economic liberty and religious liberty might help us with one of the central conundrums that preoccupies our debate about religious liberty in the United States right now, which is who's the proper bearer of religious liberty and which claims trump it? Is it the individual or an institution? So if you think about maybe debates about the Catholic Church and whether they should be implementing the HHS mandate. Do the religious liberty claims of the Catholic Church as an institution trump those of Catholic employees that might want access to contraception? Or thinking about the Hobby Lobby case where it's not the church but kind of a firm, and the owners of the firm have a particular set of religious beliefs that conflict with desires of some of their employees. So I was just wondering, can, for instance, the religious liberty of institutions then reduce like the exchange, freedom of exchange of members within institutions, or does your kind of analysis provide any illumination on how do we balance those countervailing claims?
Yeah, initially, when I first drafted up this presentation, one of the last things I had was actually a wedding cake, because the Masterpiece bakery case comes to mind as well, as that, can a individual baker refuse to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple if he disagrees with that? These are issues that are very contentious right now, but I have a simple answer to that. Exchange is exchange. Allow people to freely contract. If that baker, this is going to be controversial, especially up in Seattle. I get hammered for this all the time. But if that baker doesn't want to bake a cake for this person or that person, they'll pay a consequence for it. They'll get less business, right? But they should be free to do that, I think. Because if you don't allow that freedom, then all of a sudden, well, what about people who, can't get to your bakery by 5 o'clock when it closes? Should you be forced to stay open till 7? The government starts creeping in, starts negotiating contracts between two individuals at all times. Now, people often say, well, that's not fair to the same-sex couple that really wants to have the right to bake, to buy a cake there. And the argument often comes up, what if it's the only cake maker in 5,000 miles or something like this? Well, I said, have a Jell-O mold. Make a Jell-O mold. The cake isn't, necessarily essential in order for that. But I think that the market will allow kind of all of this sorting out, that if there is a big market and people want to freely contract with others to make a same-sex cake, or to work for a company that says we're going to close on Sundays, or we're not going to provide contraception, things like that, those things will sort themselves out over time. There will never be an equilibrium. I'm kind of Hayekian. There's never going to be an equilibrium, but you'll sort out to that. And so exchange is exchange, right? And to allow folks to do it. Again, it's very controversial, because people say, well, no, we want the freedom for, these gay couples to actually contract and do this thing. I go, yeah, I'm actually in favor of that too, but let's realize that you don't get freedom for one people by stepping on the other freedom. We have to find ways to actually allow for freedom of exchange, and that's why I focus on exchange between individuals for all people on their own terms.
Sorry. Oh, for the video. My question is just, sorry for the follow-up, just slightly different, which is, what if, like, the religious claims of a church or other sorts of institutions might come in conflict with the conscience claims of people that might happen to be within those institutions? You see what I mean?
Yeah. Well, my answer to that would be, if you're a member of a church that is asking you to do certain things and that comes in conflict with your own conscience, leave the church. Plenty of opportunities to form schisms and go to other religious organizations as well. And churches have done this historically. And in places that are religiously free, you're allowed to actually, diversify in terms of that. And churches should be fine with that. You shouldn't want these people who don't really believe your doctrine anyways. They tend to weaken your institution. So, let them go and be free. So, again, it's just, going back to, freedom is freedom. And one of my also favorite quotes in Hayek comes from the book, The Constitution of Liberty, and I'm just going to paraphrase this, is that freedom oftentimes comes with a lot of things you don't like, right? And so you might not be happy with the freedom of the institution to do this, and it might impinge upon your individual conscience, but as long as you have an equal freedom to, set out and leave and, go somewhere else, that's fine. Liberty does not grant a utopia. In fact, free societies will be filled with a lot of what I call suckiness, right? Things you don't like with people. And by the way, I've made arguments to this effect. Liberty requires toleration, right? You have to understand, you give people freedom, they're going to do things that you don't like, that's okay. Because if you don't have that toleration to begin with, you're not going to have true liberty, which is why toleration always tends to precede liberty.
Are there other questions?
So, if I understand your argument, or part of your argument correctly, it seems that you're saying tying economic liberty together with religious liberty is actually a protection for both, or it strengthens or advances both. So I just wanted to ask a question to push on that part of the argument a little bit, because it seems like public support and governmental support for economic liberty ebbs and flows and goes through historical cycles.
Yep.
So tying religious liberty closer to economic liberty seems like it might place religious liberty at risk in some cases as we go through these historical cycles. So would it be better to try to maintain religious liberty as having a special status distinct from economic liberty, rather than saying freedom is freedom? They amount to the same thing.
You've made an excellent case for what my compatriots at Georgetown have made in terms of this. So, we really need to focus on religious liberty, give up that other stuff with economic freedoms. I think I've convinced them to worry about the other freedoms, right? They want to compartmentalize it as a special freedom in and of itself. So again, you made, I think, a very articulate case for that. The ebbs and flows, yeah, there are risks with that. And you see this in Russia. As soon as religious liberty starts going down, economic liberty goes down. They're coterminous. They kind of go in cycles. And my concern is that if you allow religious liberty its special sacred place, if economic liberties start going down, you have a bunch of religious people say, well, I'm not too worried about that. I got my own religious liberty, so I'm cool. I would rather have a situation where all of our liberties are linked, and any type of special group we see ourselves in and defending a special type of liberty, sees somebody else's liberty get trod upon, that's when we say, whoa, I'm going to come to your assistance, and I'm going to help you. I'm going to defend you, because I think that is going to be more important than just carving out that sacred space for it. And I often tell you, one of the more, I think, wonderful things that I've seen in studying this stuff on religious liberty is that there's been a number of religious groups that have been very vocal in their support of religious liberties for minorities that are oftentimes scorned in society. Evangelicals have been very open about defending the rights of Muslims in the U.S. Now, there are some that don't like it, right? They get on television all the time. We got 300 and some odd million people in this country. There's always going to be some people you can focus on. But there's been some limits based upon mosque construction in different parts of the United States, and different groups like Alliance Defending Freedom and the Beckett Fund, usually kind of evangelical organizations with some Catholic support thrown in as well, have come to the defense of these Muslims. And it's been the same in Germany as well, too. The German states and different provinces have tried reducing some of the property rights that Muslims have, and a number of Catholics and Lutherans have stepped up and said, whoa, you can't do that, because they realize the minute you start doing that to Muslims, that opens the door that their religious liberties might be restricted as well. So linking these liberties together, I think, is really, really important. Yes, I do think religious liberty is a sacred liberty that we need to preserve, but I do think that of all religious liberties, so let's just focus on that goal of liberty per se.
You were mentioning the lost keys and what might sort of affect that coterminous relationship, and I wonder if the lost keys are political liberty, and that's not something you really mentioned, but it seems to me that it's a foundational issue or foundation for both political and religious liberty.
Amen. And had Ross said we need a talk on religious and economic and political liberty, I could give that, but it would have been another hour long. But no, I absolutely believe that. And I think political liberties are actually, the way I conceive it, I'm a public choice theorist. I was actually trained in public choice theory. Those political liberties, I think, are best expressed the closer you can get to the actual decision makers. I want to have as much decision-making power over the things that affect me the most than somebody thousands of miles dispersed from me. So for me, I do consider that. And I'm not Catholic, but I borrow from many of my Catholic friends this principle of subsidiarity, which is when there are political decisions to be made, try to take them down to the lowest level that impacts people as possible. Knowing that, sometimes you might have to go up levels. There's externalities that spill over and all that kind of stuff. But, subsidiarity is basically the religious conception of what we call federalism. And for me, federalism is this kind of baseline political freedom that it's not just federalism the way we narrowly define it in the U.S. Constitution, but federalism is just get political power to the people who can make the decisions that most affect their lives. And I amen to what you just said.
I want to thank you all for being here, and we'll stop now, but there will be time for questions. You can talk to him for a few minutes after. So thank you very much. Let's thank him one more time.
And thank all of you too as well. Thank you.